The story takes place in a royal kingdom. One day, two young men arrive to meet the emperor to propose to Hinael, the princess of Salur. Count Phil Cheddar of Salur and Prince Rutsviant of Trikas become honored guests of the royal palace. Phil admits that he has been infatuated with the princess for a long time. Meanwhile, Ruts believes Phil has the right to choose the woman he likes among the 5 princesses, and that woman happens to be the one Ruts likes the most. That woman is Hinael, the king's daughter, one of the 5 princesses of Salur. As soon as the two young men visit the palace, rumors immediately spread throughout the kingdom. The noble ladies chat endlessly about how both men want to marry Hinael. Even though their kingdom had previously tried to conquer the Trikas Empire, Ruts's homeland, only to suffer defeat. Therefore, they promised to offer one of the princesses in marriage as a symbol of peace. In truth, the princess already knew the answer because she had experienced all of this in her previous life. On that fateful day, the pregnant princess was returning home, in a snowstorm inside a humble horse-drawn carriage. It was truly unfathomable why the nobility dared to drive the countess away in such a condition. This seemed far too cruel, even to Dea, her close maid. The maid immediately expressed her outrage that the husband dared to openly commit adultery with another woman right in their own home. At that moment, Hinael asked Dea not to be so angry because despite everything, she was still happy to be expecting a child. During the carriage ride, the women were forced to step down because the driver reported that the carriage was broken. It turned out to be nothing more than a scheme to drive Dea away from the carriage and forcibly push Hinael toward the count. But things turned out completely differently. Who could have guessed that this was a carefully calculated plan for her to reunite with someone Hinael already knew? He bluntly declared that Lady Isabel would become his wife. Thus, he had no choice but to kidnap her. Now, he was only concerned with a single outcome. That was to make Hinael disappear forever along with the child in her womb. Without a second thought, the man quietly led her straight to the edge of the cliff and ruthlessly pushed her off. When the girl opened her eyes, she felt cold sweat streaming down her face. She immediately touched her stomach to check on her baby. Looking around, the young lady realized she had just experienced a terrible nightmare. Next, she reunited with her maid, Dea. The girl told her that after they returned from the neighboring kingdom to receive their reward, the royal palace was packed with people. Hinael herself was surprised by the fact that Prince Ruts had once again appeared in their room, but the maid reacted very strangely, pointing out that this prince had never been here before. Dea explained that the king had promised to marry off one of his daughters to him as proof of friendship, and he came here to fulfill that promise. But the main character of this story was utterly astonished to realize that this exact event had taken place 2 years ago. Right at that moment, Hinael realized that she had traveled back in time to the past. At this point in time, Ruts, the second prince of the Trikas Empire, rode his horse straight into the royal palace. The people around them immediately noticed his fierce eyes. They realized that his eyes glowed with intensity whenever he saw blood. Rumors spread throughout the castle that if not for him, the kingdom wouldn't have lost the war or paid such a heavy price. They viewed Ruts as a mad, bloodthirsty killer. Other nobles also believed that this prince ought to take one of the princesses as his wife. Moreover, Prince Viant was not even the crown prince. He held no real power in the kingdom of Trikas. Listening to those conversations, the female lead recalled that 2 years ago, everyone in the region had shared the exact same thoughts. As a result, the nobles all felt pity for whichever princess would become Viant's wife. But Hinael herself now knew that the crown prince of the Trikas Empire would soon pass away due to a severe illness. And in the upcoming war for the throne, he, Rutsviant, would emerge victorious. He would become the emperor of the kingdom of Trikas, and the princess married off to him for peace would become the empress. And after that, a pregnant girl named Hinael would die at the hands of her husband, Count Cheater. That blonde man had once sworn his love for her, but as soon as she became pregnant, he turned cold toward her. Before long, the young lady stopped caring about his love altogether. She only wanted to protect her child. Once Hinael realized she had been reborn, she decided to alter her strategy a bit. Her current goal was survival, even though she couldn't openly tell anyone about it. The maid herself couldn't understand why her mistress had to dress up so splendidly if she was going to marry Count Cheddar anyway. After all, they had 5 princesses, so why did they have to travel to a neighboring kingdom? Hinael explained that a guest had arrived at the royal palace and needed to be welcomed properly, especially since he came here looking for a bride. Dea also explained that although the king did not particularly cherish Hinael, the young lady believed he wouldn't strip away his daughter's chance to live peacefully in love. And the young lady truly agreed with the maid's perspective. Phil's mineral mines generated a lot of tax revenue, so the king certainly wouldn't refuse him. But Count Phil was not foolish enough to marry a half-blood girl born to a maid. Therefore, it was clear that the king would marry her off to him as his wife. That was exactly how things had played out in her past life. Glancing through the wardrobe, Hinael still asked if she had any more eye-catching outfits and requested a brighter piece of jewelry. And even though she disliked standing out, she had no intention of relying on love in this life. The main character of the story promised her future child that she would make the baby the heir to the empire. In this life, Hinael would take hold of her own destiny. Furthermore, knowing her fate in advance, turning events in her favor would not be too difficult. Afterward, a banquet was held to celebrate the birthday of Hinael's mother. She used to be a maid in the royal palace. The king favored her, and several years later, the main character of this story was born, and her mother was made a concubine. The noble ladies gathered to gossip about the Count of the Kingdom. Her mother believed that before long, Count Cheddar would officially propose to her daughter. Many young ladies wished to marry him. He was extremely popular, so she thought their family was very fortunate that he had his eye on Hinael despite her low birth. In truth, in her past life, Hinael had thought the exact same thing. That was why she had accepted his proposal with happiness and gratitude. But now that she knew the true nature of this scoundrel, she only felt disgust toward that hypocrite. The little princess decided she would do whatever it took to marry Rutz, despite people calling him a monster who knew nothing but blood and war. Since arriving here, he had never made a public appearance. Therefore, it would be very difficult for the girl to find an opportunity to approach him right now. But at that exact moment, she remembered a perfect excuse. Today was her mother's birthday. In her past life, on the day after her mother's birthday, something had occurred. On that seemingly unremarkable day, Rutz had killed a person inside the royal palace. Shortly after, Lady Heinel informed a royal official that Rutz had just had an item stolen and was suspecting a guard, although he might have been mistaken. The princess decided to speak with the assistant official about this issue. Hinael recounted step by step that the embroidery of the goddess on the outside of the pouch, adorned with sparkling purple gemstones for eyes, had disappeared. To tell the truth, Hinael didn't know where or how that thief stole the embroidery, but she knew precisely what this artwork looked like and who the thief was. That was why she could confidently assert that the uniform belonged to one of the guards. That young man had stolen it, and tomorrow he would meet his end at Rutz's hands. But in this life, the princess knew she had to use this information to change the situation. She told him not to worry, as she came here to resolve the matter herself. First, the lady pointed out that the young boy had found the item in the West Palace and didn't know who it belonged to, so he couldn't return it. She explained that if he handed the item over to her, she would personally return it to the prince. Naturally, the royal official could not refuse such a clever offer to safely retreat from a perilous situation. He placed all his hopes on Hinael because he had no one else to rely on. The first step of the plan was a complete success. That day, for the first time, the princess got to see the embroidery up close. It was even more magnificent than Hinael remembered. Most likely, this item was extremely valuable. In fact, Rutz treasured this object immensely. She heard that he always tried never to be separated from it for too long. Thanks to this item, Hinael would have the opportunity to meet the Prince of Tricas and perhaps even speak with him. The girl knew that if she could somehow catch his attention and get him to propose to her, everything would turn out wonderfully. Just before she could visualize the next part of her plan, the shadow of a dark figure silently crept up behind her. "I intended to kill the thief right here," he said in a deep voice, pointing his sharp sword directly at Hinael's neck. The female lead was so lost in thought that she didn't even notice Rutz entering. But the moment he saw his embroidery in her hand, he instantly acted just like a wild beast. A second later, Rutz, with swift hand movements, snatched back that sacred object and exhaled calmly. And he himself was glad that she brought it back before he could kill someone. It would have been terrible if he had arrived a bit late. Seeing the gleaming sword in the strong man's hand, Lady Heinel even fleetingly thought that she would die again in this life for the crime of stealing. Therefore, the girl began to apologize to His Highness, asking for a chance to explain. Kneeling down, she presented that she had no intention of stealing or concealing his property. She had only planned to visit her future husband tomorrow and hand the fabric back to him personally. The cold-blooded prince smirked faintly, unable to understand why she had sought him out after covering for the thief. The girl explained that she feared he would kill the thief, which might spark a conflict between their two nations. To calm his anger, the young lady used politics to pressure him slightly, but he immediately counterattacked. "If you love your country so much, why didn't you prevent this foolish invasion of the empire?" he questioned abruptly. Furthermore, the brave knight Roots could still smell the blood of the kingdom's warriors whom he had slaughtered in battle. To avoid putting herself in a more dangerous position, the countess admitted their fault in intruding upon another nation's territory, and confirmed that in this case it was entirely reasonable for their subjects to apologize. She also explained that for this very reason, her royal father had reached an agreement with the Emperor of Trikas to marry off one of the kingdom's princesses to the crown prince of the neighboring court. In return, Rutz also confirmed this statement. Besides, Rutz had heard that Hinael's kingdom had up to 5 princesses, and it was not hard to guess that the girl sitting right before him was one of them. In fact, he had not yet truly set his eyes on anyone. He hadn't even thought about whom he should choose as a wife. Although in her previous life, he had clearly rejected all the nominees. If the rumors were true, he had no interest in women at all, and the only reason he needed a wife was to produce an heir. But that child would become the heir, whereas Hinael's child would be unable to survive. In a split second, without a single thought, the young lady suddenly proposed that this man choose her. The girl said she had planned to ask him about this when he came tomorrow, saying that if he chose her, she would do anything he asked. Upon hearing these words, a faint smile even flickered on Rutz's lips. Initially, he was very angry when, after his victory, his royal father decided to marry off one of the concubine's daughters to him. But things turned out to be far more interesting than he had imagined. This time, the spoil of war was kneeling and begging him, wearing nothing but an undergarment to beg him to take her as his wife. That scene looked so strange and awkward. At that precise moment, the girl realized that her entire body had been exposed through the thin nightgown, making her deeply embarrassed, and she began raising her hands to cover her most sensitive areas. But then he expressed his surprise at seeing the lady cover her body, since she was the one who wanted to become his wife. Moreover, she herself had agreed to please her husband so he would forgive her. Thus, Hinael had to find a way to win Rutz's favor and touch his heart. The girl herself understood clearly that no matter what, she had to change her cruel fate. Therefore, she was ready to trade everything to keep her life. If you feel this would be more interesting with nothing obstructing your view, then I am more than willing. The girl spoke up before throwing the flimsy piece of cloth aside. Immediately after, the young lady stood before him in a state of complete nudity. What should she do next? Hinael had absolutely no idea. But afterward, the man tried to remedy this awkward moment. He threw his cloak to the lady so she could cover herself. Then he explained that he hadn't come all the way here to play with a woman's body. Initially, he asked her that out of sheer curiosity. And this princess dared to strip so openly and freely before a strange man. The young lady had to share with the young man that there was a man who planned to propose to her. Furthermore, she explained that her royal father was likely to marry her off to that guy, and she herself completely did not want this. Hearing this, he suggested that the princess could safely reject the betrothal, but Hinael replied that she had no choice in this situation. She only had a choice if His Highness Rutz agreed to take her as his lawful wife. In a moment, the man immediately realized how much the girl hated the chosen man. Most likely, instead of falling into the tiger's den, Hinael was about to walk into the dragon's mouth. Besides, he also knew what rumors were spreading about him. Ever since he was a child, with his ruthlessness, Rutz was more like a wild beast than a human. If he followed his instincts, he could go mad and lose control. Spilling blood was far more interesting to him than embracing a girl. But responding to him, Hinael pointed out in a cold voice that she no longer cared about that. At the same time, the young lady asked him to promise her one thing only. The prince was curious, as he currently had nothing of value. She would bear his child. All because continuing the bloodline was one of a wife's duties. The lady even explained that he might not love her at all, but at the same time he must protect and shelter the child she would give birth to. Before they could discuss this mutually beneficial plan in greater detail, a castle servant knocked on the door. It was Dia, who had seen the firelight reflecting on the curtains through the window and realized the window was open. She even offered to help the lady enter the room and close the window, but her mistress refused. Before leaving the room, he told the princess to meet him tomorrow at noon. Only then would he give his answer. After all that was said, he calmly jumped out the window, just like any other sneaky intruder. The god of war easily landed on both feet gracefully, even though this was the second floor. While his future wife trembled in fear watching him, he stood on the ground majestically like a deity. Before leaving, the prince even turned back to look with an amused expression. Their first meeting was that impressive. The princess had only intended a simple transaction. Who knew the recent situation would leave her heart racing? The next day at noon at the castle, Princess Hinel's close maid noticed that her mistress looked exceptionally radiant today. Today, Henil seemed to be glowing. Clearly, the young lady was expecting a guest. Then Dea noticed a wound on her mistress's arm. It was a scratch from last night that hadn't healed yet. But at this moment, Hinel paid no mind to her health. She was only concerned with whether that man would accept her proposal. The girl simply couldn't imagine what that nobleman was actually thinking. She noticed he seemed to have no interest in a woman's body at all. She wondered if appearing before him in that manner had changed anything. On that same day, Hinel happened to run into the person she never wanted to see. It was an influential lady who was the first to loudly proclaim that she had no idea Hinel would be here. The other ladies immediately began whispering about the meeting between the two noblewomen. The nobles noticed the face the girl had used to seduce Count Phil, and now she was trying to seduce the Prince of Tricas. Saying all of this loudly made Hinel feel extremely uncomfortable, because besides her appearance, the gossip also touched upon Hinel's mother. Those malicious noblewomen said her mother was the exact same. Hinel's mother had been forced into marriage by a drunken king, but she had to live in humiliation her whole life because of it. Therefore, she wanted to give everything to the person who would love her. She would find the prince and apologize for yesterday's incident. The princess also brought the prince the clothes His Highness had lent him yesterday in a lovely box. Afterward, the main character of the story met Rotz's assistant, Evan Renouf. He introduced himself and promised to take the lady to where his master was waiting. Very quickly, they arrived at the place where the young man was waiting. He turned around to look at the appearance of the person who wanted to be his wife in broad daylight. Just as Hinel wanted to introduce herself to the young man along with an apology for last night's cloak, he immediately interrupted her and explained that he didn't care about her name. The young man immediately brought up the topic of answering yesterday's question. He said that now he also had his own conditions. If the girl agreed to everything, he would take her as his wife. To begin with, he questioned her about her current fiancé. After all, he knew all the nobles were talking about how infatuated Phil was with Hinel. Then the young man decided to clarify whether the girl truly disliked this man. The prince also explained that the girl was making a mistake. Wouldn't marrying the count be better for her? The princess immediately explained that she didn't need such a marital life, even though she couldn't state the exact reason why. The female lead was only certain of one thing. If she told the truth, she would not be understood at all. The fear and resentment of being betrayed she had experienced were truly not easy. Therefore, that day Hinel once again assured the person before her that she wanted to become his wife. The young lady added that if he agreed, she would fulfill all the duties of a wife perfectly. The prince sighed at this stubbornness. First of all, he explained that upon becoming his wife, she would only receive a noble title and nothing more. He promised to help her, but the girl had to remember that she could not demand anything more than a child. And even after giving birth to an heir, Rutz promised not to grant the child even a single drop of power. Those were the conditions of this terrifying-looking knight. Yet the main character of the story merely replied calmly that she could easily do that. She even happily accepted all the conditions. Afterward, he promised that tomorrow he would propose to her. Now the young lady was truly happy that at least things were finally proceeding according to her wishes. Then they said goodbye to each other and went their separate ways back to their palaces. As soon as the young lady bade farewell to her future husband, her head maid, Dia, immediately asked her mistress how things went and what the young people had said to each other. Dia was genuinely curious because the young man himself had actively invited the lady. At the same time, the maid was worried that Count Phil might misunderstand everything and become jealous. At that moment, Dea couldn't even imagine that the princess would soon become the empress instead of the count's wife. That day, Hinel only said she was a bit nervous about the upcoming wedding, without revealing her cards. In response, Dea told her not to worry because at least this eternal assistant would always be by her side. The maid promised that tomorrow she would do everything perfectly to make her mistress the most beautiful. Dea sincerely wished everyone would be stunned by her beauty when the count proposed, to the point where they couldn't recover for a long time. The next day, all the fashion archives in the castle were opened to select the finest outfit along with luxurious jewelry for the young princess. and Hinael herself wanted to look truly extraordinary. But at that moment, she even wondered if she had gone too far. When the ceremony began, the girl also met the king's other daughters, including Sarah, the eldest princess. The group of sisters loudly remarked that the princess had become overly arrogant since she was about to become a countess. The young ladies noticed how different the young girls looked today. Even when leaving, they still smiled smirkingly while gossiping about the appearance of their lower-born younger sister. They pointed out that the girl was worried her husband might change his mind, and that was the only reason she had to dress up so lavishly. And although these hateful noblewomen tried to ruin the female lead's mood, that count soon appeared behind Hinael and smoothed over the atmosphere a bit. First, he praised the girl, saying how radiantly beautiful she was today. In truth, Hinael didn't really want to draw his attention, but the jewelry caught his eye to the extent that he couldn't help looking. Furthermore, at that moment, he noticed a scratch on the back of the girl's hand. He grabbed her hand to bring the wound closer and examine it carefully, then asked where this scratch came from. This caring statement would probably melt the hearts of all girls who enjoy CEO novels. But our girl was sick to death of him, and since she couldn't tell the whole truth, she had to lie that she was accidentally scratched by a tree branch. The man believed her words and became angry at her servant for making the hand of a married lady turn out like this. Deceit came easily to Cheddar. He bent down to cherish her hand, saying that tiny scratch made his heart ache. She hated this immensely. The princess yanked her hand back with disgust. Just as the people around began whispering about the count, the young man decided to apologize to the person before him. He politely admitted that he had placed the lady in an uncomfortable situation. Suddenly, a low, deep voice resonated, soft yet pleasing to the ear. "There you are, Hinael." Cheater and Hinael turned to look at the person approaching with the same bewildered expression, but contrasting attitudes. One expectant, the other annoyed. Then the prince of the victorious nation joined their dialogue. First of all, he approached the girl, showing that he had been searching for her among the crowd for a long time. Ignoring the man beside her, the prince lifted her hand, softly asking, "Your hand is injured." He touched the lady's hand and even gently kissed it, offering an apology for the wound he had caused. Cheater snatched Hinael's arm back. He had always believed he owned both her and her body. Cutting between the god of war was no simple matter. Our young man gritted his teeth and said, "What do you think you're doing?" Count Cheater cared for etiquette and said, "It seems the etiquette of the north is quite different from Phil's palace." He still held Hinael's hand tightly while explaining that the girl and this young man were not close at all, so kissing hands in such a relationship was a rude act. Of course, the blonde man disliked this rudeness, so the men began showing off their talents right before the public. First, Rutz pointed out how Phil intentionally interrupted the conversation about the princess while he was coming to greet her as a prince. He twisted it, saying this could be interpreted as an unwillingness to maintain peace between their nations. The battle between the two fierce men was delayed by the presence of the king and queen. The powerful man walked forward amid everyone's reverence, and the king himself noticed a gloomy atmosphere between the two princes, Rutz and Phil, so he decided to personally ask the two young men about this matter. Rutz said he heard rumors that one of the princesses would be married off to him today, so he asked if he could make his own choice. The count could not be outdone. He reminded the king of their previous conversation on this issue when the emperor promised to give him an answer today. Phil mentioned that he wanted to marry Hinael. If not for the two powerful men on either side, Hinael would indeed be just a lowly outcast whom nobody cared about. However, imagine the king's surprise when he heard the two young men speak and realized that both wanted to choose this girl as their wife. Even though she was just an illegitimate child born to a servant, it was quite surprising even to her father. "Hinael? Both of you?" To draw all attention to himself, Phil immediately began assuring that he had loved this girl for a long time and sincerely asked the elder man for his blessing. However, Rutz then remembered that the person before him had the right to choose any of the 5 princesses, and this knight preferred this girl above all others. What should be done now? The king himself didn't understand which choice was the right one in this situation. He simply could not refuse the heir of another empire. But even so, he had already made a promise to the count. The king decided to ask Count Rutz first. The man spoke loudly that the boy hadn't even met all 5 princesses yet, so he was being too hasty with his choice. But the guest from the kingdom of Trikas was not about to give up. In a moment, he pointed out that the king had forgotten something. Count Phil had to apologize. The prince noted that there seemed to be too little compensation for this war from the defeated side. After all, Rutz could completely burn down the neighboring royal palace and take all 5 princesses as slave hostages. Therefore, everyone knew very well that the king had simply dared to try to kill him, and not just once. This could truly have become a threat to the kingdom. Thus, the Emperor of Salur ordered the young count, who held such an honorable position, to immediately apologize to the lord of the neighboring land. Phil had no choice but to sincerely apologize for overstepping his bounds in front of His Majesty, and now he could only hope that Rutz wouldn't be angry and would just enjoy the evening. Afterward, Rutz remembered that the only way he could enjoy this evening was by marrying that very girl. The count pulled Hinael toward himself, and explained that with that, he would overlook those impolite actions. Naturally, Cheddar flew into a rage but had to keep his mouth shut. At this time, Hinael's mother began to loudly express her view that this should not happen. She broke into tears, begging the king to change his decision. However, Rutz then noted that yesterday he had lost an item and Hinael was the one who helped him find it. In return, he would help the girl find her place, welcome her, and take care of her. She was what he wanted from this country. Hinael immediately noticed how gently her future husband spoke about all of this. Besides, she knew it would be better than having her mother watch her leave reluctantly. Before letting the young princess depart, the king explained to her that she was now also accountable to His Majesty, all for the benefit of their empire. After those words, it became clear that the king had given his blessing to the newlyweds. While Phil was visibly fuming with rage, as if adding fuel to the fire, Rutz decided to apologize for taking away someone who almost became the count's wife. Right there, the man also suggested the person opposite take a chance. It turned out Rutz wanted Cheddar to choose someone else instead, and to choose right now. The king also considered this a wonderful proposal and immediately ordered the count to choose his future wife. But the only person Phil needed was Hinael. Yet now nobody bothered to listen to Phil. Power lay in the hands of the man who could slaughter the entire kingdom of Salur. He simply said, "Choose." The man was so desperate that he pointed his finger at a completely random girl and designated her as his wife. Shockingly ironic, Hinael covered her mouth in fear. The truth was this lady was Rutz's wife in her past life. Thus, the female lead became Rutz's wife, while that lady became the count's wife. Destiny had been completely inverted. To escape this uncomfortable situation, the Prince of Trikas draped his arm gently over Hinael's shoulders, loudly remarking that his bride was a bit surprised by everything that had just happened and requested to speak with the lady in private. Together, they stepped out into the castle garden to be alone. Of course, this was just an excuse to leave that place. Rutz said he had fulfilled her request and asked if she had any issues. The young girl pondered for a moment before answering. The female lead truthfully said she was happy not to marry that Phil guy, and she was genuinely grateful to Rutz for everything he had done at her request. So that business was done. Now he began enjoying his privileges. The weather that day was so hot that the young man was starting to feel sleepy. He immediately stretched out on the bench to Hinael's curiosity. Looking at his nonchalant posture, she wondered if it was really that hot. Then the young lady remembered that in Rutz's homeland, it was winter all year round. So this might be her very last summer. While sitting on the bench, Hinael suddenly noticed a pregnant woman walking by. It seemed the woman was in the final month of her pregnancy, the most difficult time when one's entire body becomes heavy. But could there be any greater joy than welcoming a little baby into the world? In her past life, Hinael had never experienced this. Therefore, she was now eager to see her baby as soon as possible. If only she had lived a little longer back then. Overwhelming emotions caused the girl to be unable to hold back her tears. The girl admitted that she simply missed her mother and suddenly burst into tears. That day, Hinael shared how her mother had been a maid in the royal palace. She only received a noble title after giving birth to her daughter, but His Majesty did not love her at all. Afterward, the woman realized that without her here, her mother's life in this damned palace seemed to be much worse. It wasn't hard to guess why Hinael was bad-mouthed so much, since her mother used to be a maid. It seemed the man had heard everything, as he immediately understood the issue. However, he confessed that he didn't like this one bit. The moment the girl heard Rutz's reaction to this matter, she even thought she had wasted her breath telling him all of this. But either way, he would find out everything sooner or later. In a flash, the young man decided to ask the person before him if it was the king himself who got drunk and forced her mother. Yet now everyone was laughing at Hinael and her mother. He grumbled that the king was the only one to blame for everything, He was the one who uttered those terrible words. Furthermore, Rutz added that he disliked everything about this country, from the weather to the culture. The prince promised that as soon as they settled the engagement, they would leave this place immediately. But before that, Rutz decided to advise the girl to spend this time with her mother. The young man had no intention of returning to this place ever again. Afterward, he held out his hand to support the lady so they could leave together. After all, sitting under the hot sun was still far too scorching for him. Then, hand in hand, the young man and woman headed toward the royal palace. On the way, the young man reminded the girl not to cry in front of others. Otherwise, it would look as if the prince was forcing her. In addition, he decided to find out if the young lady thought what he said in the main hall was true. Hinael, who carried so many rumors, now had to look as though she had won a victory. They needed to pretend that the count had fallen madly in love with her at first sight. That would be more reasonable. If her mother thought her daughter was being taken away by a northern barbarian, she would surely cry, and Hinael simply didn't want anything like that to happen. Just listening to his advice, she felt deeply grateful for how the young man cared about her mother's feelings too. In fact, the count simply hated seeing women cry, because this wasn't a war. At the same time, responding to her thanks, he explained that it wasn't out of care either. Rutz was simply trying to act strategically. Anything was better than blindly swinging a sword at the enemy. In the end, they stopped their idle chatter and said goodbye. After returning home, Mi, the designated wife for Cheddar, decided to speak with Hinael. She wanted to congratulate Hinael on her engagement. Mi was 3 years younger than Hinael, and although they were both princesses, Mi's status was much higher than Hinael's. The noblewoman born of a prestigious family was born in the 4th palace. She had a very calm and gentle personality. Perhaps Hinael hadn't tried to make friends, but in their past life, they weren't close either. That day, Mi decided to apologize to the person before her because the truth was she was the one Cheddar chose. But Hinael immediately explained that she had nothing to apologize for since the count was the one who chose her. Hinael was quite surprised that her half-sister was happy about that marriage. She must have been very surprised. In fact, Mi had long dreamed of becoming the wife of someone like the count. It was a childhood dream. The princess had never dared to imagine this would happen to her in real life. As soon as the female lead received the information, she immediately didn't believe that this young lady was in love with the count. Well, perhaps this outcome of events was for the best. But this was what would happen if Mi repeated Hinael's fate from her past life. Unnoticed by anyone, the focal point of their discussion, Count Phil, quietly approached the lady. He wanted to speak with Hinael and offered to do so when they were alone. As soon as both retreated to a hidden corner of the palace, the first thing Hinael decided to do was congratulate the young man on his wedding and ask him to take good care of Mi. However, Phil didn't want to hear congratulations or the name of his future wife right now. He demanded she only congratulate him when he won Hinael back. This sounded extremely strange coming from the young man's mouth, because they had decided that matter right in front of the king. However, Phil declared that he wouldn't give up easily and asked his companion to wait. "I will surely save you, because you belong to me." The man spoke with a terrifyingly confident tone. This madman thoroughly terrified Hinael. Since the count was drunk, the princess decided to pretend she hadn't heard anything like that. Afterward, the girl thought about returning to the drawing room. On the way, the young lady happened to run into her future husband, who noticed the look of extreme fear on the woman's face. Rutz immediately paid attention to the girl's anxious expression. She pulled her husband's sleeve to return to the banquet hall. Hinael was frightened but didn't want to cause any trouble, so she kept quiet about it. But the prince sighed upon seeing through the issue. The god of war's gaze was razor-sharp. Behind her was a man whose eyes looked as if he wanted to devour another man's bride. Rutz glared toward that hidden corner and declared to his wife that he would teach the guy lurking around his wife a lesson. The prince's hand was solemnly extended to her. Therefore, Rutz decided he needed to show that guy how to treat a lady. His bride looked bored, so the young man thought to himself, why not let them dance together? However, at a certain point, it was worth asking permission from the castle's master. Naturally, the king was delighted with such an offer. They, along with the highest nobles, could not miss this dance. Besides, Rutz added that dancing alone was boring. It would be better if the two newly married couples danced together. Then he mentioned Phil and me. Of course, the king completely agreed because he wanted the young people to affirm their union with a dance in his hall. In a moment, instruments began to play, and the young people blended into a rhythmic dance. At that moment, Hinael fully understood that her husband was merely acting. Yet somehow, the girl still felt shy. The prince danced much better than she thought. Men from the north possessed great physical strength. Not a single person among the crowd could tell who was an enemy. It would be great if they could show the Count what the current situation was like. However, it seemed this had no effect on Phil. He also stared intently at Hinael. Now the Count truly understood why Hinael so thoroughly hated this young man. He was a disgusting fellow best kept at a distance. The dance continued, and suddenly the young man thought he could lift the girl he chose and spin her in midair. No sooner said than done, he abruptly placed his hands on her waist. And the half-blood princess at this moment was truly an admired princess. Embarrassed, Hinael immediately demanded to be put down. Although he seemed to be admiring her in his arms, Rutz obediently listened. Then he set the girl down so abruptly that she accidentally stepped on his foot. In reality, the young man had done so intentionally. He slowly and sincerely gazed at her, the intimate way he called her name. "I just wanted to look at you closer, Hinael," leaving her stunned. And even though it was all a show performed for the public, he and the Count that day looked as if they were truly young lovers. Other nobles noticed how hot the men from the north were. The guests couldn't help but notice the way the young man looked at the lady, as if he were truly madly in love with her. Right at that moment, without a second thought, the young man decided to gently touch the lady's face and give her a passionate kiss right in front of everyone. Hinael was stunned by how intensely he kissed her. She glanced at Cheddar's probing gaze from afar. To add to the authenticity, she decided to get deeper into character and responded to the prince's kiss as naturally as possible. In just a moment, they blended together. She felt she had acted so deeply that her heart was pounding like a galloping horse. This romantic image left the surrounding audience staring blankly and commenting with admiration. A few others showed jealousy. While their lips merged in a passionate kiss, Phil continued to watch the couple intently. His face went blank with annoyance, and helpless rage surged within him. Afterward, the wedding ceremony took place as promised. It was held before the witness of the gods. It was the tree bark that the couple signed their names upon, symbolizing vital energy. That tree bark intertwined the destinies of the young people and guided them on a path of endless blessings. It also opened the gates of love. Listening intently to the officiant's words, the girl was once again convinced that in this life, she would surely have a child. This time, Hinael promised herself to decisively keep the baby and never lose her child again. Never would she let it slip away again. However, throughout the wedding, her companion noticed how her bride was trembling. The lady explained that she was merely nervous. Now came the time to light the flame sent down from the gods. The moment the officiant touched the young man's hand, he felt a wild surge of energy. The source of energy within Rutz was frighteningly powerful. Then the man demanded that the tears of the fire god itself be brought forth immediately. It was quite a sudden request, as it was unclear why the archives needed to be opened and religious relics brought out. At this point, others were even worried that something had gone wrong with the ceremony. Based on what he saw, the officiant explained that he simply felt this person was emanating dark magic. As soon as the royal official expressed his view, the others were completely shocked because it was the prince standing right before him. How could an evil spirit appear in such a sacred place? However, the prime minister felt that if dark magic truly resided inside Rutz's body, then this marriage could not take place. All of this only made the groom laugh. This was the first time the young man had encountered such absurd rumors. They stood facing each other in a rather tense situation. Suddenly, Hinael noticed a small object in her husband's hand. She was surprised and quietly observed it. A bit of blood lightly seeped onto the sharp edges of the strange object, flowing from Rutz's finger as he pressed hard on it. The Count assured that this marriage was no different from the submission of defeated Salur to Trikas. He also noted that the young men might view canceling the engagement as an act of evading responsibility for the war. However, the officiant continued to assure that the fire god's tears would clarify everything. The official splashed holy water onto the Count's face, because he knew that when holy water and dark energy collided, smoke would appear and the result would show right on the face. After all, ever since this officiant received the omnipotent will of the fire god, he had never made a single mistake. However, this time he was still proven wrong. The young man turned out to be completely clean. Rutz knew nothing of such mistakes, but he was certain that diplomatically the priest should at least be held accountable for his disrespect toward the young groom. For his part, the officiant still refused to believe what was happening, considering all of this simply impossible. However, how much more humiliation did he intend to subject Rutz to? Now the Prince of Tricas only wanted to finish the entire ceremony as soon as possible. The priest was saddened by the first failed judgment in his life. The few splashes of holy water were quickly wiped from the groom's face, and just like that, they proceeded with the rest of the wedding ceremony. A few splashes of holy water on the priest's hand still felt somewhat off. He was unwilling to accept it. After what happened at the office in the West Palace, Rutz told his close assistant Evan what had transpired at the wedding ceremony. Evan was quite surprised and amused to learn that King Barasel had presented 500,000 gold coins as a wedding gift. Then the commander announced that they had to leave the kingdom of Salur today, despite this being only the first night. Rutz grumbled about the old man, unbuttoning his shirt as he spoke. Evan asked if Rutz was referring to his father-in-law, but he was just irritable toward the bishop. At the same time, his hand was literally bleeding, though the small wound was negligible to him. And that was still better than having smoke on his face. After all, Rutz knew that those who worshipped the gods for a long time often had a special sensitivity to evil spirits. And this holy servant had recognized the Count's condition. The item Rutz was tightly holding at that precise moment had literally saved the man's honor. The Count had scratched his own fingertip and absorbed the energy, preventing him from being detected. The Lord knew royal secrets could not be revealed, which was why the prince proposed leaving today. However, the assistant also reminded him that he needed to meet the king before the trip. And although it wasn't overly crucial right now, it was still worth considering what to do with the heir princess. The prince sighed tiredly. Is that so important? Because right after that he passed out, obviously not because of the scratch on his hand. That same night, Hinel told her mother she would leave Salur with her husband tomorrow. Her face looked gloomy from having to part from her mother so hastily, but her husband had sent orders to that effect. The concubine had guessed it would happen so soon, as the prince was clearly offended by the incident at the wedding ceremony. After the humiliation from the prime minister, leaving tomorrow was hardly surprising. But tonight, the mother would be able to stay by her daughter's side one last time. Of course, Hinel wanted to spend more time with her mother before leaving. But she could do nothing about it. Now the lady could only promise that everything would be fine. She persuaded her mother that her husband cherished her. On that same day, the mother decided to give the most precious item to her daughter. It was something her brother had given her a long time ago. Her mother was promised that this potion would help her gain His Majesty's favor, but the woman had never been brave enough to use it. At that moment, the lady recalled that when she married Phil in her past life, her mother had also given her this precious bottle of water. They had also said goodbye like this, and that was the last time they ever met. The gift her mother gave her was a potion that could change a person's heart. A few months after the wedding, Phil lost all interest in his wife, and in desperation, Hinel used the potion to win back his love. Thanks to that, the main character of this story had a child. But ever since, she was never able to share a bed with him ever again. Now the lady considered this the most appropriate time to thank her mother for everything. She begged her not to worry about her, promising to become a true princess of the empire and serve the prince. Immediately after, the women embraced, saying goodbye and promising to write to each other, and then the lady stepped outside. The attendants had gathered in the castle courtyard, but Prince Rutz had not yet appeared. Before the lady and her husband left, the king reminded her not to forget who she was. After all, as emperor, her father had married Hinel to the Tricas Empire in exchange for peace between the two countries. He believed that with such responsibility, mistakes were not allowed to occur. For her part, Hinel promised to do her best. At that moment, the girl realized that in difficult moments of parting, her father was ultimately still primarily a king, rather than a loving father. Afterward, the emperor shared that the prince had left since yesterday. It seemed he was still angry after that incident, for her father asked the lady to try to appease her husband. It was time to depart. She reluctantly bade farewell to her mother. But before the lady stepped into the carriage, Mi rushed over. Mi didn't expect them to part so soon. Luckily, she still made it in time to say goodbye to Hinel. Mi regretted that they hadn't dared to chat before, hoping they could be more open. For the first time, Mi dared to call Hinel sister because she was too shy, while Hinel was of low status and never thought of being close to the other sisters. But now, Hinel and her younger sister would officially be close, promising to write letters to stay in touch. They could still communicate. At least writing letters to each other in the real world was entirely possible. The two sisters decided to embrace one last time and promised to meet again someday. And now it was time to say goodbye. The carriage gradually rolled away from Salur Castle. On the way to the northern castle, her close assistant, Dia, simply could not stop crying before departure. Hinael told Dea to stay in Salur, but the maid refused. As a result, seeing her bitter tears, Hinael relented and allowed her to come along. But on the way to her new home, the lady also shed non-stop tears. Now she cried because the prince had disappointed her. Dea simply could not imagine how the groom dared to abandon his bride on their wedding night. Even if he was angry, this was no excuse. But Hinael was still surprised why the maid was so sad, since from the beginning, this marriage was contracted solely for peace between nations, and the maid knew that for sure. But the assistant had noticed how gently and lovingly the prince treated the lady. Yet now, just last night, he behaved so coldly. In truth, for the main character of this story, merely being freed from Phil was enough. That was why that day, the lady admitted she should thank her husband for at least showing a bit of kindness. And even if he continued to treat her coldly, that would be her punishment for Salur's crimes. During the carriage ride, while looking out the window admiring the beautiful scenery, a knock sounded on the carriage door. Hinael asked the person outside, and he looked quite familiar. It was Evan, her husband's assistant. It turned out Prince Rutz had asked his assistant to deliver a message to his wife. Meanwhile, at the Count's place, Phil was informed that Rutz had not actually accompanied the messenger, and only Princess Hinael was moving in the carriage. He seemed interested in that report. He chuckled joyfully, because according to such a rushed timeline, the girl he chose surely hadn't slept with her husband yet. The guards heard that the prince had stopped at the Viscount's estate in the neighboring town of Drew. Simultaneously, as soon as the lady's carriage stopped, Evan first asked permission to inform the lady about the schedule. Before long, they would have to cross the canal and enter Tricka's territory, but they would have to travel through the night. They would definitely need to rest. The prince had arrived at the Duen border and they would stay there for a day. The assistant reported that the prince apologized for having to leave early due to urgent business. Or rather, he had passed out before having time to leave a message, and Evan had to make up an explanation for his superior, and the princess didn't need to know such complicated matters. Hinael felt quite relieved that her husband hadn't left ahead out of anger after believing Evan's notification. She politely thanked her husband's assistant and learned further that they would take a boat at Baixia Canal Town, so they would need a light meal first. This long journey made Dea both scared and anxious for her mistress. She believed their master must have grown tired of her to leave like that. Thankfully, that wasn't the case. Hinael didn't expect much, so she wasn't disappointed. She cared more about Dea's feelings. They stopped at Duen that evening. The girl hesitated nervously. Is His Highness Viant here? The master of the estate came out to welcome the honored guests with a respectful attitude for now. Immediately after, the lady thanked him for the greeting and asked where His Highness was, as she wanted to meet her husband. Then Evan informed Viscount Drew that everyone was exhausted, so he suggested postponing the reception. The Viscount promised to prepare a delicious meal for the men. However, the girl wondered whether her husband would come for dinner. The lady still didn't know for sure if he had finished his business. Only then did Evan decide to reveal a few things to the princess. Evan said His Highness had accidentally ingested poison and fainted. The young man explained that this was likely a plot by the Empress of Tricas, Rutz's stepmother, unrelated to Salur. He always had trouble with his half-brothers. Fortunately, Rutz's guards used the antidote immediately, and his life was no longer in danger. But the man would still need more time to recover. All of this meant that yesterday, the men had only pretended the man left due to an incident so nobody in Salur would notice. Evan also reported that after His Majesty was brought here, they tried to get to him as quickly as possible, and then the assistant apologized to the mistress. Now the assistant explained that the lord needed rest, so tonight the newlyweds should sleep separately. Evan also asked her to keep what they had just discussed a secret. What she just heard truly shocked Hinael. How could such a powerful person be poisoned? Who would have thought such a thing could happen? After dinner at Drew Castle, Hinael returned to her room and prepared for bed. While Dea brushed her hair, the girl decided to ask her mistress if she had met her husband, as the prince hadn't even come for dinner. Hinael told herself she had to keep everything a secret from Dea. So she decided to tell the girl that he was very busy today, so perhaps he was dining in his study. But it seemed Dea didn't like this answer at all. Because on their wedding night, the newlyweds were dining separately. They also slept in 2 different beds, which from an outsider's perspective seemed utterly outrageous. Even though Hinael tried to explain to the maid that the prince was busy and shouldn't be disturbed, the stubborn maid still decided to sleep outside the room just in case, because who knew if His Majesty would suddenly appear in the bedroom with his wife. Though the girl's persistence only made the lady laugh. If she kept that face, the prince would surely turn around and go to another room. Hinael couldn't tell Dea about the poison, but she felt that as long as her assistant was here, everything would be fine. Now the girl could only hope that this time Dea would have a wonderful life in the north. Just as the lady began falling asleep, before a good dream could even appear, she suddenly felt someone lift her up roughly and carry her directly over his shoulder. By that firm grip, she quickly recognized that these were the hands of a strong man who had seized her. "Be quiet!" the intruder threatened in a menacing voice. Just as the lady was about to scream, the man bypassed the guard with dizzying speed and escaped. Clearly, this guy knew the area very well, but why did he kidnap the girl? Where did he plan to take Hinael? Looking around the area, the lady quickly realized they were heading toward the forest where no one would find her. So the girl immediately decided she had to leave some kind of sign. She dropped her hair ribbon straight onto the ground in hopes of being rescued. While the criminal remained completely unaware, a second later, His Majesty opened his eyes. Finally, he was able to regain consciousness. Evan, who had been watching his master closely, reported that the young man had been unconscious for 2 days. The assistant also reported that the others had arrived here yesterday right on schedule. At the same time, Evan said His Highness had no need to worry about that princess as she was safe. Her husband smirked, saying he didn't care about that unfamiliar woman, for now she was merely compensation for the war. But at that exact moment, the men heard the screams of the princess's maid. They were tearful cries for help that instantly worried both men. Dea reported that Lady Hinael had disappeared. Dea knelt down in desperation, pleading. Rutz's boastful words from a moment ago vanished. His face turned pale as death. The maids had been ordered to keep quiet about the lady's disappearance. At this time, the assistant asked the prince if they should form a search party. They had 30 knights accompanying them, and Rutz seemed to be sitting there analyzing the situation. However, Rutz decided on his own that he would go alone. Of course, this decision did not satisfy the chief assistant at all because His Majesty had just woken up, and now he was going to get involved in a criminal case. However, Rutz understood that if the knights searched, rumors would spread. It would be easier if he handled it himself, despite Evan reassuring the Lord that the ladies would quickly notice since 2 people had vanished. At the same time, Rutz understood other rumors might spread. Therefore, if necessary, he ordered Evan to just say he and the princess went on their honeymoon. Furthermore, he and the princess had already displayed affectionate actions in Salur, so others would definitely believe this story. Then the commander ordered them to head west to the neighboring city of Tubone, and in the next 3 days they would meet in the city of Hawkwick. However, the assistant thought it was impossible for one man to find the princess and reach the neighboring kingdom within 3 days. But Rutz was completely confident in his abilities. Now, a man had to turn the impossible into possible. After all, he knew very well that one of them was the mastermind. Either that crazy Phil guy or that damned third prince. If Rutz failed in this mission, he would sow discord between the 2 nations. And then that brat, along with his mother, would destroy him. Now, the more time wasted, the higher the chance the princess would not be saved alive. He needed to pinpoint her location before death arrived. So the Lord ordered the chief assistant to contact the nearby organization and find out who was behind this evil plot. Ever since the emblem was stolen, the man had been haunted by a strange feeling. They had tried to drag him into a conflict with Salur, but failed. This time, he was accused of being the cause of the princess's disappearance. It was always like this. After his mother's death, the new empress brought along an older son than Rutz, providing indisputable evidence that the emperor had cheated even before his mother passed away. That half-brother had taken the crown prince position, while the other brat wanted to strip Rutz of everything. After Rutz was cast aside to maintain his position, he took up his sword on the battlefield and survived on his own. That was how he kept his standing in the royal family. And he was almost stripped of everything and thrown away without pity. But now, Rutz decided he would never let that happen ever again. That day, the weather was so cold that the main character of this story felt like she was about to freeze to death. Seeing that they were running north, it wasn't hard to deduce that the lady was being brought to the Tricas Empire. At that moment, the girl suddenly thought the kidnapper might be someone from the Empire. In Rutz's past life, there had been many disputes surrounding the succession to the throne. Was the first prince or the third prince behind this? Naturally, that was entirely possible, and her deduction was quite reasonable. In a few seconds, a stern voice ordered the lady to step down. A sword pressed close to Hinael's neck, leading her forward. The girl was terrified, not knowing where they were taking her. Then a familiar voice sounded, declaring he was glad to see the princess again. Just hearing that voice, she knew clearly that Phil hadn't let her go. "I told you, Hinael?" He laughed coldly. "I will find you no matter where you are." The familiar silhouette of that hateful man suddenly appearing on the horizon confirmed it. Furthermore, Phil openly expressed joy that Prince Rutz had not touched her body yet, because she definitely belonged to him. Sensing the entire atmosphere and hearing this tone, the lady understood where they were right now. This was Nun Mountain, the place where the lady had been murdered in her past life. The present was repeating itself once again. With a gentle facade, Cheddar caressed her, telling her to stop crying, even though the bastard didn't even care that Hinael was nearly freezing to death. Despair overwhelmed her so intensely that Hinael's emotions overflowed, and she burst into bitter tears. Was a cruel fate once again about to end her life? Was the main character of this story truly destined by fate to become a prisoner of this terrible man? And would her child once again never be born? The lady had no intention of leaving things to chance like this. At this moment, she decided to run away. This time, Hinael wanted to alter the course of destiny in her favor. However, naturally, she couldn't run very far. Phil's henchman immediately seized the girl, tightly grabbing her hands to prevent her escape. After the Count approached the woman he chose, he feigned pity and called her name. He ordered her to stop resisting. In essence, he just wanted his merchandise to remain intact. Cheater even took off his cloak for her. Suddenly, he saw a few marks from the recent scuffle on Hinael's body. This made the master furious. He demanded his servants be gentler with her and not injure her. In a fit of rage, the man simply could not control himself and delivered a fatal blow to his subordinate. The assassin instantly lay still. "You must have been very frightened, but there was no other way." The evil Count immediately spoke right after committing murder. Furthermore, the man realized his subordinate had not only injured the girl, but also dared to set eyes on something that belonged solely to him. That was Hinael's body. Phil believed he simply couldn't let this guy live. After stealing the princess, Phil personally brought the girl back to a manor. Now he believed nobody would find them there, and he even saw a bit of romance in this setting. In truth, that man had gone completely insane. Cheater asked after her affectionately, while Hinael trembled all over from fear. Then the beauty decided to ask what was happening with Sarah, because Phil had married that lady. But in response, the blonde man roughly only promised her she didn't need to worry about anything, and he would handle everything himself. In addition, the Count was now eagerly looking forward to his wedding night with Hinael. Phil still behaved like a lustful monster, every second remembering that he wouldn't let that night Rut snatch away his bride. Indeed, the man acted as if he had completely lost his mind. After all, Hinael's marriage was a treaty signed between two nations. An empire didn't simply force it. However, the man was no longer listening to his companion. He only paid special attention to how frozen cold the girl's feet had become, because the man didn't want to spend their wedding night with a cold body. Right at that moment, the lady was convinced that from the beginning the Empire wanted to carry out this kidnapping, or Phil had arranged it as such. This meant he had kidnapped the lady under orders from the Empire's leaders. As known, Rutz's position was inherently precarious. He was frequently dragged into royal affairs, and the knight captain had stolen his relic. If that was true, then the captain had acted on orders from the Empire in that theft. But thanks to experience from her past life, Hinael had recognized him much earlier. However, the man no longer felt nauseous and lunged straight at the poor girl's body. He wanted immediate gratification as he had almost gone mad. Now, regardless of his companion's consent, he yearned to warm her with the heat from his body. At this time, Count Rutz was desperately searching. He called upon a trained eagle. No matter how much he didn't want to do so, he now had no other choice. The young man handed the relic to the bird and ordered it to go to that exact location, after which the raven had to return to its master in time. The magic stones absorb dark energy. The further the stone was from Rutz, the stronger the dark magic would become. Ever since he was a child, the boy had been guided by beastly instincts. His senses grew more intense with each passing year. An ordinary person would never be able to detect a faint trail of scent, but Rutz could easily find his enemy. He found traces of her lingering in the forest. Finally, Rutz was able to retract that sense. Meanwhile, at Phil's castle, the man continued to detain the lady by force, no longer restraining himself from touching the beauty's body. Unfortunately, in this situation, the girl couldn't do anything at all. But even then, she didn't want that hateful man to touch her with even a single finger. All Hinael could think of at that moment was using words to change the situation a bit. She softly called Phil's name and explained she disliked it because it felt like coercion. The lady pointed out that it seemed the young people had been separated because of her father, but she knew how much he loved her. The lady explained she wanted gentle, warm embraces like those of lovers, and then she could warm herself in those arms. After listening carefully to the girl, Phil had to agree with her. He even realized he wouldn't want to spend their first night in such a manner. Then the girl realized she looked completely terrible because of this situation, so she declared she wanted to bathe and change into fresh clothes. In fact, at that moment, Hinael was merely stalling for time, delaying as long as possible. Phil surprisingly believed everything the girl said, and even promised to prepare everything for her comfort. He dismissed all servants from the manor so they wouldn't disturb them. So she needed to wait a moment until the man prepared the bathwater himself. The man's biggest mistake was leaving the lady alone. As soon as the bastard left the room, the girl immediately ran to the window, understanding this was the most perfect time to escape at all costs and buy a bit more time. She quickly grasped the situation and braided a long rope from the window curtain, then dropped it down and prepared to jump from the balcony. Meanwhile, Cheater joyfully returned. Hinael hadn't managed to climb down before she was discovered. Well, just as the girl climbed to the outer side of the room, the man immediately rushed to the balcony to forcefully hold the poor girl in midair. Then he roughly pulled the girl back into the bedroom, and immediately demanded in a scary voice what the hell she was trying to do. Receiving no answer, the man decided to ask how she dared to lie straight to his face so blatantly. Now Phil's anger was so intense he was ready to kill the lady with his own hands. He screamed while strangling Hinael, "You're just a bastard half-blood. The blood of a servant flows within you. Is this how you repay my love?" The gentleman was screaming about how much he disliked the way the girl first rejected him, and then dared to mock him to this extent. At the same time, to clarify the mistake the lady had made, the man said if she became his wife, he would have treated her like a princess. But now the man believed the lady was merely his mistress, a slave and nothing more. Although she wasn't, he even thought she had become an easy woman who should know her place. Right then, the man noticed a scratch on the woman's face. Since he hated scars, he decided to treat the wound, unwilling to see the lady in such a state. But before leaving the room once more, he warned her that if she deceived him again, her first night would be a living nightmare. Now poor Hinael was so terrified she truly had no strength left to think of escaping. Meanwhile, Rutz found Phil's subordinate stiff and lifeless. Looking at that Salar assassin, it was easy to come to the sad conclusion that quite a bit of time had passed since he was neutralized. At the same time, the gentleman caught a dense scent of his woman. Her scent emanated most strongly from that house. Based on that recognition, Rutz knew clearly where his wife was. Rutz ordered the eagle to bring the sacred relic back to him. The flow of dark energy was suppressed again. The Count simply couldn't lose control right now. He had been away from the sacred relic for too long and needed time to readapt. As soon as Phil discovered the scratch on Hinael's face, he decided to go to the castle to fetch ointment for her. At the same time, he threatened his girl that if she intentionally tried to escape again, he would render her unable to walk for days. But Hinael herself at that time seriously pondered, if Phil continues to ruin her like this, would a real man, Rutz, still accept his woman after this? If the lady became his slave, she would live a life even worse than the past. But first of all, it wasn't worth thinking about that right now. She had to find a way to escape from here. The panicked beauty did not give up. She decided to look around the room and search for something that could help her escape. Then the lady picked up a small iron rod leaning in the corner. At this moment, the girl decided to hide behind the door, so that as soon as Phil appeared, she could give him a thunderous blow. Hinael stood there and waited nervously. The only strange thing was that the door was not unlocked with a key. In an instant, the front door was kicked wide open. Fortunately for Hinael, the silhouette of Rutz, who had specifically broken into the castle, appeared in the room. Hinael looked at her husband in shock, not expecting him to show up here. Rutz anxiously called her by an affectionate name. Hinael. Hinael had not yet calmed down, still tightly gripping her weapon. The prince felt more at ease and teased her. Do you plan to welcome me that way? That's quite mean. The princess immediately ran over and hugged her husband tightly. The sudden emotion made the young man feel quite strange. Meanwhile, Hinael was crying bitterly out of emotion at being saved just in time by her contractual husband. However, Rutz needed to separate from her immediately. He told her to calm down and removed his wife's hands. Rutz's situation was urgent. He couldn't reveal he was in an extremely sensitive stage, and close contact like this was dangerous. With a very difficult expression, he made up a random excuse, such as saying Hinael was being overly intimate. His lady apologized and explained she was just overjoyed to see him here. The prince saw the scratch on Hinael's face, which worried him quite a bit about what had happened. His wife recounted she tried to escape, and this was the result. Rutz felt so annoyed he cursed, I can't imagine that bastard dared to treat you like this. However, now wasn't the time to act out a romance scene. So first, the gentleman suggested leaving here. He asked where her shoes were. Hinael said she didn't have them. Indeed, nobody stole her shoes. They were still in her bedroom in Duen, and they needed to leave before that bastard noticed. Her husband carefully draped his cloak over her, sighing without knowing what to say. Because walking barefoot in this weather was truly too much for her, her husband picked her up in his arms. He added that her walking speed couldn't match being carried by him. Hinael remained submissive in her husband's arms, both touched and surprised. Just a moment ago, he wouldn't even let her hug him. But she was far too exhausted. This feeling was truly warm to her. Rutz leisurely carried his wife out toward the door. But as soon as the young man stepped across the bedroom threshold with his lady in his arms, he immediately confronted his enemy, Phil. The blonde bastard was so stunned he dropped the cup of water he brought her, then immediately decided to draw his sword to attack the uninvited guest. And even though Rutz knew Phil had completely lost his mind, he was still very annoyed by the Count's insolent tone. And even a madman was not allowed to lay hands on a member of the Tricas royal family. Now Rutz also intended to fight this insolent fellow. The rebellious Count truly hated the man who had stolen his girl. But swordsmanship was not his strength. Knowing himself and his enemy, he retreated immediately, because who could beat that god of war? However, at this moment, Rutz also noticed the presence of guards in this palace. It seemed they had been summoned. Then he ordered the woman in his arms to stay here and not go anywhere. He walked imposingly down the hall, drawing closer to the enemy. Phil immediately smirked because their assassins would arrive shortly. He even ordered the prince in front of him to return the girl, promising to spare Rutz's life. Rutz realized the situation and asked who was behind the order to kidnap the princess. But Phil thought now was not the most suitable time to talk. So he ordered Hinael to be returned first, and then they would talk. But Rutz had no desire to do that. He warned that the Count's crazy tone would make him look miserable. And the swords immediately collided, creating a harsh metallic sound. It sounded like a duel, but in reality it didn't last 3 seconds. The Prince of Tricas was a legendary god of war. In less than 2 sword strokes, Chater was defeated. The moment Phil's hand touched the sharp blade, Rutz decided to ask the man who had commanded him in the first place. Clearly, Phil was truly terrified for his life. Because standing before him now was a seasoned knight, extremely skilled in weaponry and exceptionally brutish. Rutz had just kicked him. A small tooth rolled across the floor while the Count wept bitterly over its loss. However, the prince was still fuming. He pressed his foot against the insane Count's head on the ground. He repeated the question about who directed this affair. Cheater tried to endure the pain to buy time, believing the assassins would quickly arrive. Rutz naturally realized how Phil intended to wait for his men. Rutz smirked and asked about the appearance of those foolish assassins wearing black cloaks. Basically, today those men wouldn't be able to come, nor for a long time after. They were simply unlucky that day to have met this brute of a hunter. All 11 of them had been neutralized. Well, now it was time for Phil to answer who had given him orders. It turned out to be Third Prince Kylo. The boy admitted he was merely following instructions from that man. Who knew a brother in the Tricas family could be so ruthless? Even after Rutz learned the full truth about his brother's dirty order, the young man still decided not to leave Phil alone. So he delivered a thunderous punch to the thick-faced man for daring to touch his wife. Confronted with this wrath, no one could stop Rutz. A few minutes later, the girl decided to go downstairs upon noticing dead silence on the first floor. As soon as she arrived, she witnessed an extremely pitiful beating scene. Hinel cried out in horror, yet was somewhat amused. That madman had now turned completely senseless. Then the man she chose unlaced the boots from his exhausted opponent's body and handed them to the girl. "My lady, you'll have to wear these shoes because you'll have to walk a distance," he told her. While putting on the shoes, the victim decided to ask about Phil's pale body. Of course, Rutz hadn't killed the poor guy, and currently there was no reason to worry about that. They had enough trouble with the kidnapping of a lady. Now it was time to head back. Having known him for a long time, even after the kidnapping, Hinael still felt the need to ask her companion if it was okay to leave poor Phil in this state. In truth, Rutz really wanted to send Cheater to heaven, but this affair wasn't as simple as it seemed. It was even a trap. It seemed Phil was connected to a much larger demon, specifically with the poisonous snakes of the Empire, none other than Rutz's third half-brother. The prince said his father would blame him for being unable to protect his family himself and pin all the guilt onto this poor son's head. He would surely find 101 reasons why Rutz failed in his peacekeeping mission. Although Rutz also admitted failure in protecting his family, he couldn't let that fool go around broadcasting to everyone. At the same time, to lighten the atmosphere, the man decided to point out the reality that his wife was much stronger than she thought. At that moment, the lady had wanted to use that object to knock Phil out or finish him off altogether. The knight immediately realized the female lead possessed far greater strength than she realized. After all, the lady had endured all of this without shedding a single tear, even though she said her strength was only due to being by his side. Such behavior from a fragile, noble-looking woman was truly admirable. This made her husband look at her with different eyes. Finally, Rutz's guards arrived. Mighty leather-armored horses galloped up, huffing from a hard ride. The prince put his hands on his hips wearily and ordered the men to clean up this mess. Evan reported that they had followed the tracks, but because they were in a rush, they hadn't brought many supplies. Unfortunately, there was no horse for Hinael, and it would take quite a long walk to reach the carriage. Though this wasn't very necessary anyway. A war horse was too wasteful for a girl as light as a bolster pillow. Rutz picked her up with ease. He was even amused by cherishing this newly collected small treasure. Then he asked Evan to find clothes and shoes for her. Decisively, Rutz carried her toward his horse. The small girl was placed on the horse's back, and then the man sat right in front of the lady because he knew she didn't know how to ride a horse. The prince asked the girl to hold him tightly from behind and warned that they would ride very fast, so she had to hold tight. Otherwise, Lord forbid, the foolish girl would fall on the way. The men were riding their horses exceedingly fast. At times, Hinael even feared she would fall. She trembled along the way, and such physical contact was like torture to the beast inside Rutz's heart. Her husband pursed his lips to calm himself from such sensitive sensations. The more the girl rubbed against him, the stronger his intense desire became. Helplessly, Rutz decided to talk a bit with Hinael that as soon as they returned to the palace, she should learn to ride a horse. Knowing nothing at all, Hinael felt wonderful that he cared for her like that. She hugged him even more confidently, promising to practice riding hard with her husband. The prince felt as if life was coming to an end with this innocent girl. When the men reached the carriage, the young man decided to take a quick nap in the cabin. Rutz sat huddled in a corner far from his wife, though he didn't dare leave her out in the cold weather or out of sight, lest there be another danger. Hinael looked at him intently. He truly was sleeping exhausted. She suddenly had the idea of covering him with a blanket, the man who had searched for her all night until now. But just as the lady was about to do so, he immediately woke up and brushed her hand away. Rutz asked her not to do foolish things and to leave him alone. Hinael felt bewildered. He was too volatile. Right then, the lady noticed that the count's breathing had become much heavier, and he was even muttering curses. So she decided to ask if the young man was all right, as his face was dripping with sweat. Due to his condition, Rutz couldn't sit quietly beside the girl, but he also couldn't tell her about it. He tried his best to restrain himself, his thick black eyebrows furrowed, both hands holding his body tightly. Stepping out of the carriage was not the best choice, because if he moved even a bit, everything would only get worse. The more she looked at her husband's unstable face, the more worried Hinael became. Only then did the lady decide to touch his face, and in a flash, an electric shock seemed to pierce through every nerve cell in Rutz. He lost his temper and yanked her hand away. "I told you to sit still!" Yet even now, she only cared that his hand was so warm. Anxiety welled up inside her, thinking of a fever caused by catching a cold. At the same time, this rather unstable posture made her notice that his leg area was quite tense. She covered her mouth in embarrassment. She understood his situation roughly now, but she thought she was quite blameless, having done nothing special. Rutz crossed his legs to hide his embarrassment, and his wife was no less embarrassed. She didn't know that her mere presence nearby was enough to kill a beast in a cycle of suppressing its sexual thirst. At this time, the atmosphere became so awkward that the girl decided to change the subject, and she asked the young man how he managed to find her. It turned out Rutz was able to do so thanks to her hair ribbon dangling on a tree branch. The beauty's plan had succeeded. While being kidnapped, she had intentionally thrown the ribbon down, hoping someone would notice. Her husband also praised her for her sharpness. Right then, the lady also unexpectedly asked to stop the carriage and suggested taking a short walk, because she didn't forget how this man had rushed to find her, and a full day had passed. Perhaps he needed rest. Therefore, they should stop and rest in a warm place. After arriving at the nearest inn, it was already dark. Evan supported the prince's shoulders and pulled him into the room. Clearly, the young man was exhausted to what extent right now, but he didn't even intend to contact Sir Leneuve, only requesting the knight to tell the staff that they would be delayed by half a day. They left the young couple alone in the room. Hinael didn't know what to do. She wondered if she should help wipe his body. He was exhausted and only asked her to step outside, to leave him alone. Despite Hinael's concern and asking to care for him again, he only grew more somber and drove her out. In the closed room, her scent drove him insane. The more she moved, the stronger her scent emanated. The good wife only asked to help her husband change clothes so he would feel more comfortable. This devilishly seductive girl was truly troublesome. Poor Rutz had to turn his face inward in deep endurance. His wife's scent attracted the Count so intensely that he could no longer endure it. And with all his strength, yet simultaneously with special gentleness and passion, he pulled her arm forcefully. Rutz no longer had the ability to resist, and Hinael even less so. He said grumpily, "If you try to undress me now, you won't be able to leave this room so easily. It won't just be the playful teasing of a hungry beast inside me anymore," the man explained in a more threatening tone, while his wife showed no fearful reaction at all. Previously, it seemed he had no interest in a woman's body. But what had changed so abruptly? The girl speculated that all of this could only be due to the poison. Despite that, Rutz still continued to order the girl to leave his room in a final attempt. Otherwise, things would get worse for her. He spouted a few poetic lines saying this place wasn't good enough to enjoy a honeymoon. Decisively, the prince stood up intending to leave the bed. Yet the lady acted in her own way. Then the princess gently wrapped her arms around the young man's shoulders. And then she embraced the man with her entire body. She said this place was wonderful. She couldn't forget how the prince had saved her from the clutches of that ruthless man. But that was only to protect the peace alliance between the two nations. The young lady believed the prince probably had no affection for her. However, right now he seemed to be in an agitated state. Therefore, this beauty knew she needed to take advantage of this opportunity to secure her position and create an heir, with a secret yearning that her beloved child would return. So the lady decided to take advantage of this moment and held the young man tightly. Then she reminded him that she was his wife, and moreover, she had promised to fulfill all her duties beforehand. The lady explained that if the man wished, he could do whatever he wanted with her. Less than a second later, their lips merged in a passionate, intoxicating kiss. Precisely speaking, he could not resist his wife's kiss. The thirst didn't seem to originate only from him. It had spread to her at some unknown point. However, even in such a moment of weakness, the man still controlled himself and understood he simply couldn't give in to the instinct of possession right now. Otherwise, if he did, innocent blood would spill. And then he would once again become the monster everyone feared. The man understood he should try to push the girl away from him immediately. But his body didn't seem to listen to him. At that moment, his endlessly agitated soul unexpectedly seemed to regain peace. What was this feeling? The communion of two souls didn't seem to drive Rutz mad, but rather had a healing effect. The prince had never felt so warm and pleasant before. The fragrance from her body enveloped him from head to toe. And it was so pleasant for a man to feel all of this. He was stunned in amazement, all lust completely dissipating. But why he felt so good right now, he would never be able to explain to himself. At that time, the lady noticed her husband had calmed down a bit. Then she suggested they enter the bathroom together first. Then the wife realized neither of them had eaten anything, and so they could ask someone to prepare something while they bathed. Rutz used to try to avoid talking to women, thinking it would make him look more like an animal. But now, strangely, he no longer felt that way. So that evening, he had no problem accepting the offer regarding his wife's contract. Before long, the bath was prepared. In reality, usually only mercenaries or assassins stayed overnight here, so there was no folding screen at all. No guest needed one. Rutz told the inn's maid to let them be. He naturally unbuttoned his tight shirt while speaking to his wife, saying he didn't want to complicate the situation further, so he hadn't told the innkeeper who they really were. She told him to soak in the bathtub before the water grew cold and then made to leave. She was unexpectedly asked to stay and serve. He argued that she was the one who said she would do whatever he needed. And he also believed she needed a bath too, didn't she? Therefore, the man suggested saving time and bathing together. Her husband became a talented orator, stating the necessity of doing so. This was also nothing strange, as it was part of the marital duties of newlyweds, he seriously presented. No matter how embarrassed the girl was, she knew there was nothing wrong with this, since she wanted to have a child as soon as possible. So it was best to do it right now while she was still attractive to his body. Thus, the girl began undressing to step into the tub. Only the feelings inside the man at that time were extremely strange and unusual. He glanced at his wife and blushed. Even though every centimeter of her body had been thoroughly studied, now everything carried a different feeling. Before the lady completely removed her outer layer of clothing, the young man loudly announced that he had changed his mind and asked her to step out. The knight argued that, after all, this was their wedding night, and spending it in a hotel would feel a bit uncomfortable. In reality, this was the first time he had experienced such emotions. They were extremely strange feelings of shyness. The awkward situation continued to escalate, and right at that moment, Rutz was forced to suggest the girls sleep separately today and reserve the full first night for when they returned to the prince's palace. The lady herself at that time had the feeling that he was intentionally avoiding her. Although at first she felt that a moment ago he had been aroused, suddenly his mood had shifted. The young lady understood that if he lost interest in her body and she missed the opportunity, she wouldn't know how long she would have to wait. Therefore, the beauty decided to declare she was completely comfortable and continued undressing. Once she had exposed her entire body, she informed her husband that he could do whatever he wanted with her, wherever he wanted, whenever his heart desired. She would obey every wish of her husband. Soaking in the warm tub, the girl comforted herself that this intimacy wouldn't be as difficult as she imagined. Moreover, in her past life, she had also been pregnant. As soon as their bodies were only a few centimeters apart, the young man immediately used force to pull his lady toward him, pressing her tightly into his arms and kissing her passionately. Rough, intense, his touches were completely unlike Phil's. Unlike Phil, the hands of the Prince of Tricas were touching a woman's body for the first time. Yet somehow, in those clumsy hands, Henel's body seemed to melt. During lovemaking, the young man said he didn't want to do it here because it was too cramped, and he feared he would hurt his lady's fragile body. That was why he suggested continuing everything on the bed. Only before leaving, they needed to dry off. However, the young people had only taken a step toward the room, and then the young man could no longer restrain himself and continued passionate kisses on the princess's lips, gently fondling down to her neck. When the two were on the bed, the girl still hadn't completely stopped fearing her partner and didn't fully trust him. And even though the lady had experienced this in her past life and understood that here, just like with Phil, she only needed to close her eyes and endure, she still couldn't control the urge to push her husband away. The girl frankly admitted she was a bit scared. Then the young man only asked her to tell him as soon as she felt any pain. It seemed at that time his wife was convinced that everything was truly fine, so they spent the night together. The next morning, Ritz brought breakfast straight to bed for his lady. It was time to eat breakfast and hit the road. At this time, the young man noticed bruises on the girl's neck and a cut on her cheek. Not to alarm her husband, the humble woman explained that all these injuries were the work of that blonde bastard. But the remaining marks, specifically the passionate burning kisses, were left by the prince. The young man last night was so wild he even told her to endure as long as possible before he could stop. Even while having breakfast, the man still couldn't push their night of lovemaking out of his mind. He really didn't want to go crazy and rush at her like that, but it seemed something in his head had gone haywire. As before, the one dubbed a monster believed all of this happened solely because instinct had possessed him. However, Rutz couldn't help but think that it was a completely different feeling. It wasn't like the feeling a predatory beast gets when pouncing on its prey. It felt more like floating on clouds. It was so warm and pleasant that Rutz wanted to repeat it and wanted to know how he had felt at that moment. During breakfast, Rutz also decided to share his portion of meat with his wife. Because only eating vegetables wouldn't keep her full for long, the food at this hotel really wasn't very good. Once they returned to the palace, the newlyweds would no longer have to worry about eating. Although Rutz had warned his companion in advance that the cuisine there was a bit different from Salur's, most likely the girl would find it a bit unfamiliar. And to be honest, Rutz also felt it quite difficult to eat during all this time in a strange palace. Trikas favored smoked meat, and when smoked, the flavor would become much richer. While discussing such subtle nuances of nutrition, the young man suddenly realized how much this morning resembled that of newlyweds. Of course, they weren't exactly a real couple, but last night turned out to be far more wonderful than the main character of this story had imagined, even though at first she had been terrified. Despite the rumors, the lady was convinced her husband didn't seem cruel at all. On the contrary, he was even cute in a few moments. After the girl finished her breakfast, she had to get ready because the men would leave early. But before they intended to leave, Rutz offered to repeat last night's success and do it again. Then the boy confessed that yesterday he had restrained himself so the lady could get a bit of sleep. But now he could take his time and enjoy. Later, the prince and his wife were sitting in the carriage. Truthfully, that day, the sweet lady really felt it wasn't easy to sit down after all that had happened between them during that passionate night. Fortunately, her husband noticed his wife's discomfort, so he even asked the driver to slow down a bit, even though the count had a lot of business to settle and was always in a hurry. However, the young man explained that in any case, they had decided to meet in Hawk tomorrow, so they could move slowly without rushing. The man explained he had warned Evan in advance about changing plans. But right now it seemed Hinael only cared about her maid Dea. She would probably be terrified. In truth, no other princess cared for her maid as much as Hinael. The young man explained that the young lady should stop talking nonsense and go to sleep as soon as possible. And to ensure his wife's comfort, the young man slightly tilted her head and rested it on his shoulder so the lady could quickly close her eyes and fall asleep. It seemed the prince, after all, possessed a bit of sweetness, at least in such vulnerable moments. A few hours later, the carriage carrying His Highness the Prince and the Princess arrived in the kingdom of Hawkwick. There they were met by Evan and Dea. Clearly, the maid had missed her mistress to the point of literally hugging the princess tight. Meanwhile, Evan treated his boss extremely seriously. The assistant also announced he had matters to report to his superior. It wasn't something women should hear, so the commander stepped aside with his staff. Evan could confirm the hypothesis that this was Prince Kylo's work. It turned out a group of mercenaries in Drew had accepted money from the royal family. They kidnapped the princess, but now all Rutz could do was turn a blind eye. Currently, there was no other way out. They couldn't call Phil out as a witness. Even if the escort team brought the Lord to the palace, he would be able to give matching testimony. And on the positive side, if the man spoke the truth, he would be accused of conflict with the Duke and Salur. If this went public, the situation wouldn't be very favorable for Rutz. Furthermore, Prince Rutz knew all the nobles would be delighted at the death of the successor to the throne. Evan was full of anxiety that the princess had been terrified by that monumental incident. This question made Rutz recall Hinael's shock yesterday. It was indeed quite shocking. But everything turned out much better than Rutz had imagined. At least that was thanks to the bravery of his companion, who might have personally stood up to defend her own safety. When the topic turned to the girl, Evan decided to express his curiosity about whether the opportunity for the man to win the woman's heart had been wasted. Last night showed the gentleman had restrained himself due to poor health, but reality quickly indicated otherwise, as the man had rushed through his wedding night. Rutz admitted he had been affected by a spell, and a few things had happened on the side. Saying that, the prince coldly slipped away.